All right, so the official title of the talk is Can Monkeys Be Moral? So let me start. I'm going to start by trying to orient everyone in biological space. So bear with me for a moment. I'm leading up to something. So I'm going to start with the first. Want to be clear that humans are part of something called the animal kingdom, right? So this differentiates us from plants. We're not plants. We're not bacteria. We're not algae. So we're part of the animal kingdom. And then as part of the animal kingdom, we're part of something called the chordate phylum. And that, so that differentiates us from, say, lobsters. We're not lobsters. We're not worms. We have a backbone. We're part of the chordate phylum. And we are part of the mammal class. So that groups us together with bats, rats, elephants, and whales. But we're not fish at all. And we're not birds and we're not lizards. We have sweat glands and we nurse our young. So we're a mammal. And then we are primates. So that groups us together. Some of our closest relatives are lemurs. We should be friendly to lemurs, they're relatives of ours. We're lemurs, monkeys, orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. So something that's distinctive about all of these friends of ours are they were all evolved to jump around in trees. So they have good 3D vision. So they were designed to live in trees. So we're part of the primate order. Next, we're part of a family called the hominid family, more specifically. Sometimes the hominid family is referred to as a family of great apes. So we're a great ape. In that group, you get orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. So that's, still, we've lost monkeys at that point. Monkeys aren't great apes. So they're getting farther and farther away on our family tree. And then we're part of something called the hominin subfamily. And now that's where we say goodbye to orangutans. That's not part of our family anymore. The only people left in that family are gorillas, chimps, and bonobos. So now we're down to there. And then finally, we're part of something called the hominini tribe. And that's a very, very exclusive tribe. It only involves 3 types of animals. The 3 types of animals are us, humans, and then you have chimps, and you have bonobos, and that's it. So no gorillas, no orangutans. Those are our most close relatives. If you go down the whole tree of life, you end up there with us sitting right next to, the other 2 are part of something called Pan. We're sitting right next to bonobos and chimps. All right, so it's important to understand that we are very, very close genetically to bonobos and chimps. We share around 98% of our DNA. It's different depending on how you compare DNA, but we're very, very genetically close to both bonobos and chimps. They estimate that we split off from chimps and bonobos only about 5 to 7 million years ago. So that's like a blink of an eye. That's nothing at all, 5 to 7 million years ago. If you're assuming a 20-year generation, that would be only about 300,000 generations, right? Since we split off from a common ancestor. So 300,000, you can count to 300,000, probably take a few days, but you could count to 300,000. So we're not that far, distant from our friends, the bonobos and the chimps. We also are just as related to a bonobo as we are to a chimp. We share about 1.7% of our 1.7% closer to a chimp, and we share another distinct 1.6% to a bonobo. So we're just about as close to either one of them, but we're different from both of them. So, and there's some, as you'll see, there's some really important differences between the behaviors of chimps and bonobos. Okay, so let me talk in general about some of the differences between chimps and bonobos. And I'm pulling most of this material from Frans de Waal's books. So I'll cite the specific books when we get to them. And also from Brian Hare's study. He's done a lot of studies on bonobos and chimps. So those are the 2 main sources I'm getting this from. But let me start by general overview. So both chimps and bonobos, they have complex societies. They have complex social systems. And actually, one of the things that distinguishes humans and bonobos and chimps from every other living animal is the fact that we have societies that consists of males working together and just about, well, nothing else does. So if you look at gorillas, there's only one silverback gorilla that's leading the the troop. And if you look at orangutans, they're all solitary by themselves. But the one thing that we share with our closest relatives is we have to work together as a group. We have to cooperate, and that's something distinctive about the final tribe that I was talking about. So all of us, we develop complex society. Another thing that's in common with all of us is we all hunt meat. So both bonobos and chimps, they hunt monkeys. Now remember, monkeys are primates. They're not part of the great apes. So they're pretty distantly related. But they all, bonobos, chimps, and humans eat meat in some form. Bonobos and chimps, they go off on hunting parties and they hunt down the monkeys. And it's a small percentage of their diet, somewhere around 4% or so. I mean, it's mainly, veggies, but they do have the meat diet. Now let's talk about some of the differences. So often when people talk about chimps and bonobos, people say that chimps act as if they're from Mars and bonobos are from Venus. And the idea there is they are very, very different in their societies in that bonobos have matriarchal societies, and then chimps have patriarchal societies. And in general, chimps are very aggressive. They remind me a lot of Klingons, and they're very aggressive, very hierarchical. Bonobos are often compared to hippies. They're called the hippie monkeys because they tend to not be very aggressive at all. They're extremely affectionate, and they do a lot of kissing, and yes, that's a euphemism. All bonobos are constantly kissing to resolve conflicts all over the place. One of a dramatic example of that is when chimps meet a new tribe of chimps, they immediately start fighting and there's deaths. They kill the rival tribes. When bonobos get together, there's all sorts of kissing involved when they meet a new tribe of bonobos. So they have very different relationships in nature. All right, so let me give some more specific stories. Let me start by talking a little more about what bonobos are like, what it's like to be a bonobo in a bonobo society. And here's a description of I'm just going to take out a couple of stories to be illustrative, so you can get a sense of what it's like to be a bonobo and then see what it's like to be a chimp. So starting with a bonobo, this is from Frans de Waal's book, The Bonobo and the Atheist. It's a good book, recommend it. But in that, he talks about a story involving a bonobo called Volker. Now, I said before that bonobos in general are rarely violent. They hardly ever get upset. But this was an exception to that. And that's why it's so interesting when they did get upset. So in this story, there's the alpha female of the bonobo tribe. Her name was Kamba, and she had a son, an adolescent son named Volker. And if you're a bonobo, it's really great to have the queen as your mother, right? Because you can get away with everything. You can go run around, get yourself in trouble, and then you have your queen backing you up. So you can get away with a bunch of stuff that you wouldn't normally be able to get away with. So Volker was an adolescent, and in this case, the researchers were observing Volker, and they noticed that there was this tree full of fruit. And Volker went jumping onto, a limb to grab some fruit from the tree, tasty fruit from the tree. And there was a mother who was also on that limb. Her name was Amy, and she had a newborn baby. And when Volker jumped on the limb, it almost caused the mother and her baby to fall off, and it would have injured, the mother and the baby. It was far enough up. And so immediately the mother started chasing Volker off the limb of the tree. But then every other bonobo in the area went jumping down, and they all rushed around. Volker and started attacking Volker, and they dragged him around. And the researchers finally got into. He wasn't killed. In fact, there's not one incident of anyone ever seeing a bonobo kill another bonobo. Period. In a zoo or in the wild, unlike chimps who kill all the time and do all sorts of other nasty things. Bonobos there's never been a recorded incident of a bonobo being, bonobo homicides. But of course, in this case, Volker was terrified. He was completely terrified what happened to him. And the interesting thing is they went off and they found Volker's mother, Kamba, who's the queen, right? Who would normally protect Volker. And she was huddled away in the jungle afraid too. And so the interesting thing about what happened is you have to realize that, again, Volker's mother is the queen. And Amy, the mother, who was endangered, is a pretty low-ranking, bonobo in this situation. But still, the whole troop got together to punish collectively the behavior of an adolescent that got out of control and jumped on a limb and endangered someone. And he had to pay the consequence regardless of the social structure of the organization. He had violated their rules, right? So that's one story. The other thing I want to bring up. This is actually some research I came across from Brian Hare, who did an interesting experiment on bonobos that tells you something about how bonobos act. And I find this, maybe it's because I'm more chimp than bonobo myself, but I find this really bizarre. So I'm just going to relate to you what the experiment was and what the conclusions were from it. But here's the setup for the experiment. They set up 3 rooms, and in the middle, they would have a bonobo come in. And the idea was that there's some food that was placed in the center room, and the bonobo could either unlock the door on the right or unlock the door on the left, and the bonobo could see in both the rooms on the left and the right. And what they did is, in the left side room, they put one of the bonobo's tribe mates, so someone from their in-group, from the bonobo's in-group, and the other, on the right-hand side, they put a stranger, a bonobo that the subject had never seen before. And they wanted to see, well, what would the bonobo do? Well, so what they found, over 73% of the time, is that when a bonobo walked into a room, they didn't scarf down all the food themselves. What they would do is they would immediately go to the stranger's room and unlock that, let that bonobo out, and then share the food with the stranger, which was surprising, right? I mean, that seems kind of crazy to me. And then what was even more surprising is often what would happen is the newly released stranger would go across and release the other bonobo, and they would share the food all among themselves, among all 3 bonobos. And the strange thing about that is that, as the researchers pointed out, if that was a chimp, whenever there's a situation where there's a chimp around who's outnumbered by strangers, the chimp will run screaming from the room because that's just a dangerous situation to be in. Bonobos are actually xenophilic. And I had to fix the spell checker on my computer for xenophilic because recognized the word, and I had to read it a few times. And they actually prefer strangers over their own tribe. So given a choice, they will share food with someone that they just met instead of someone that's part of their own tribe, which is, I think, very odd. But anyway, we'll come back to that. So that's what bonobos are like. Bonobos are generally, they're very, very playful. They do a lot of kissing. They are very egalitarian, and they tend to they're clustered together, and they live lives of cooperation with one another. Now, chimps. Let's move on to chimps. Chimps are very, very different. Chimps are famous for being much more aggressive, and so let me give you a couple of stories about. This is from another book from Frans de Waal. This is from a book he wrote a while ago and just updated in the 90s called Chimpanzee Politics. And in this book, he describes a couple of primary characters, but one of them is a chimp named Mama. And Mama originally was the head of a tribe of chimps that they had been keeping in this zoo called Arnhem Zoo, where they had about 25 chimps on an island. And so they were studying. Frans de Waal spent most of his life studying this tribe of chimps. And what the Mama was the head chimp. She was the dominant one. And in general, that doesn't happen in nature because usually, it's a patriarchal society, so males dominate. But in this artificial situation, Mama got to be in charge. And main reason was she was by far the biggest. She was the oldest one. She was in her 40s. Chimps, I guess, generally die by the time they're 50. And so she was around longer and much more massive. And she was dominating. She was the queen of the chimps for this particular tribe. So she was apparently she wasn't a very good ruler, though. They had all these hospitalizations of chimps under her reign. So I forget what this did. It was 1 or 2 a week that they had some serious injuries. So it wasn't a great society to live in when Mama was in charge. But they wanted to introduce some new male chimps into the colony. They had gotten 3 new males, and they weren't sure, what Mama's reaction to the 3 new male chimps were. So at that time it was winter, so they keep them all in this enclosure to keep them warm. And they introduced the 3 new males, and immediately Mama and the existing chimps started attacking the new males because they were a threat, right, to Mama's control over the chimp society. And so they kept attacking the chimps. The chimps would immediately run up to the top of the drums. They would, all three of the males would huddle together. Apparently they would scream nonstop. They had nonstop diarrhea and vomiting, and not a good situation to find yourself in. So what they decided to do is they decided to remove Mama temporarily from the colony. And they also took her top lieutenant. She had a backup person named Gorilla. Not actually a gorilla, that would have been cool, but another chimp named Gorilla. So they took Mama and Gorilla out of the colony, and immediately when they removed Mama and Gorilla from the colony, one of the new male chimps, this is apparently what chimps do, he started a nonstop drumming ceremony. That's what chimps do when they want to take over a tribe. So he started immediately drumming nonstop to build up support, to drum up support. And after he did that, he started doing, aggression displays. And so they had Mama out for like 3 months. And then when they bring Mama back again, let me just describe it from the book, because he writes it better than I could say it. But the entry of Mama and Gorilla into the hall caused enormous excitement among the chimpanzees and was accompanied by a deafening din. The scene was similar to the one in the very beginning. The three adult males piled one on top of the other on the highest drum, and they were screaming incessantly. Again, they had diarrhea for fear of the females. When some of it landed on Mama's leg, she took her time to clean her coat thoroughly with a piece of frayed rope. Mama was extremely aggressive toward the three males and attacked them as much as possible. So Mama's come back and she's, trying to regain her stature. But then what she discovered is she turned around and she had no backup at all. She had absolutely no backup, and she lost control of the colony very soon after. One of the interesting things that Frans de Waal emphasizes in his book is he likes to distinguish between physical power and social power. And he said that the most important thing in a chimp society isn't physical power at all. In fact, whenever there's male fights, they're always very constrained in what they do. They won't use their front teeth. They won't, attack each other in certain ways. But what really matters is the coalitions that the chimps build up. And most of the politics book, this is why it was so interesting, is devoted to talking about how much time chimps spend building coalitions on the side. They go off, they groom other chimps, they try to build up a team of people, and it can take months to overthrow an existing chimp and take their position in society. So it's all very, Machiavellian and evil and all that, so it's fun. But anyway, so that's what chimp society is like. If you want to decide between being a chimp and a bonobo, those are the basic, parameters of your life. So what the question comes up immediately, well, why is chimp society so different from a bonobo society? And so just in terms of, there's a big river, the Congo River, that divides chimps from bonobos. And there's a lot of theories why, and they've only been separated for a few million years, but they have dramatically different societies. One theory is that chimps have to share their land with gorillas. And so because of that, chimps have to go off on long parties where they're away from the main society. And unlike bonobos, who are forced to stay together. So they have to work out their differences and they have to come up with strategies. They've had to come up with strategies over time to be able to live together in society. Unlike chimps, who they get away and they have hunting parties and they come back again. So that's one theory. There's a general theory that the difference between bonobos and chimps has to do with the fact that they're very similar until they get to be teenagers. And then after they're teenagers, what happens is bonobos remain playful and very affectionate, but chimps, on the other hand, become much more aggressive. And so there's a theory that also bonobos are underdeveloped chimps, right? Is that the idea is that they just don't keep progressing through the same stages as chimps do. But again, there's only a few million years of a difference between these two different types of animals, and we are very closely related to both. There's only about 5 million years of difference between us and the common ancestor of bonobos and chimps. So we're all very, very closely related here. Okay, so let me get to the main topic of this sermon. And the main topic of the sermon is the whole question of morality in chimps and bonobos. So I'm going to start by talking about two really interesting experiments that were done on this. I'm going to start with the experiment on fairness. I don't know if you've seen this. There's a good TED Talk on this, if you've ever seen it, with the Capuchin monkeys on fairness. So let me give you the setup for that original experiment. Then there was a follow-on that's even more interesting. But if you haven't seen the TED Talk, here's the setup. So they had two monkeys, and we're talking about monkeys here, not bonobos or chimps. They had two monkeys in cages next to one another, and they gave them a really, really dumb task. All the monkeys had to do was hand them stuff, right? And so what they had is they had a researcher who every time a monkey handed them, they would give them something. They would give them a treat, and they could see each other's cages. But what they did is they started to give one of the monkeys cucumbers and the other monkeys grapes. Now, I didn't know this, but apparently grapes are really, really good stuff in monkey society. So getting a grape is a really good reward, and getting a cucumber is, it's okay, but it's a cucumber. And what the funny thing about the experiment, you should see it on TED if you haven't seen it, is the monkey who starts getting the cucumber starts flinging it at the researcher and refusing to take it because, it's unfair. Who wants a cucumber when you can get a grape? But of course, if you think about it, that's completely crazy. If everything's just about maximizing utility and trying to maximize fitness, cucumber's food, right? Why is the monkey throwing away food? But the monkey is throwing away food because it's unfair. That's more important, the fairness issue, than the food issue in this case. Now, the interesting thing is, so that experiment was done by Frans de Waal and by Sarah Brosnan. And Sarah Brosnan went on and she did an additional experiment. She took the same experiment, but then she did it with chimps to see if chimps would behave in the same way. And the interesting thing about chimps, so same setup, except for the chimps, she did carrots and she did grapes. But carrots and grapes sitting side by side. But here was the big difference between chimps and monkeys. When you did the experiment with chimps, so in the case of the monkeys, it was the one who got the less good treat that got upset. But in the case of chimps, both monkeys get upset. So even the one who's coming out ahead, it's not like, yeah, I get the grape. Sorry, dude, I have the grape here. Even the one who's coming out ahead with the grapes, he feels that the situation is unfair, and he starts getting upset with the researcher as well. So interesting thing about chimps is they seem to have an even higher developed sense of fairness than monkeys do. Okay, so that was one experiment. And Frans de Waal writes about that. Fairness and justice are therefore best looked at as ancient capacities. They derive from the need to preserve harmony in the face of resource competition, right? That's the idea. That's what they were trying to show with the experiment. So the other experiment I want to describe has to do with chimp versus bonobos in cooperation. Now remember, everything I just said about chimps and bonobos, they're very different, their societies are. So what they wanted to do is set up an experiment to see, well, how well do chimps and bonobos cooperate? So what they did, the first one was pretty straightforward. What they did is they put one bowl of food that was hard to divide up. They put it in front of some chimps, and they saw what happened. And not surprisingly, the chimps did not divide up the food in a very friendly way, and the chimps don't play nicely together. When they put the one bowl of food in front of the bonobos do their general thing, lots of kissing and playing involved, and they managed to get the food divided up equally, and everyone came out ahead. So bonobos were able to cooperate super effectively, not so much with chimps. So they tried a more advanced experiment where what they did is they put a board of food outside their cage, and they had the rope, right? You might have seen this before too, where they have a rope where they have to cooperate together to get the board of food to come so that they can get the food. So in the case of both the chimps and the bonobos, if you had two bowls of fruit on the board and they were able to pull the board up close, they figured it out, they could do the experiment, they could cooperate together, and then they could each get their food. Now, again, what the researchers did is they combined the food into a single bowl on the board, and then the response was completely different. Bonobos still cooperated, got the food, were able to share it. Chimps were not able to cooperate, and so they weren't able to get the food. So again, it has to do with bonobos are far less aggressive. Chimps are overly aggressive, and so they can't cooperate well in an enclosed society when they're forced to do it. All right, so those are the experiments. So I just want to make 3 general points before ending about the experiments. Point number 1, clearly morality is social. It's something that develops with social animals, right? Bonobos, monkeys. And remember, the distinctive thing about us, and by us I mean, you know, us and bonobos and chimps, is we're the only animals where males have to work together. We're distinct in that. All the other guys, they don't have to work out ways of cooperating. So we're special in that we have to work with other males. What morality is social means to me is you can't even talk about morality when it comes to sharks. Sharks don't work together. Or thermostats. There's no such thing as talking about morality when you talk about thermostats. You can't say, you know, the thermostat did something bad today. It's something that should really only apply to social animals. And the other part of that idea, too, is if you happen to be the last man on Earth, you can do stupid things, but you can't do immoral things, right? You know, again, it's a matter of being part of a society. That's where moral rules develop. Okay, that's point number one. Point number two, pretty clearly, morality is biological. It has a biological basis. These are, if you look at the bonobo and the chimp tribes, these are universals among bonobos and chimps, the way that they behave. They have done brain scans. They've taken, you know, bonobo cadavers and chimp cadavers, and they claim they can find differences in different areas of the brain having to do. So they think there's a biological basis for this. But I don't want to oversimplify that. I mean, it's one thing to say that we have an innate sense of fairness, which I think there's sufficient evidence to say that, you know, humans, just like bonobos and chimps, and elephants for that matter, have an innate sense of fairness. That's not to say that all of our moral judgments, it's not like you can just look inside your heart and know what to do. Clearly, remember the case of Volker, who jumped on the branch and had to have the whole tribe get together and tell the bad adolescent for endangering, you know, the newborn baby. So there's also has to be, you know, a learned component in there as well. Finally, point number three, morality is contingent. And by that, I mean, you know, if our evolutionary history was just a little different, we might come up with a different morality than we have now. Again, refer to, you know, the case of the bonobos versus the chimps. They had slightly different, you know, living arrangements because of the existence of gorillas or not, or because, you know, availability of food or not. And so they developed different social structures that made sense on their particular conditions that they had to live on. And, you know, my claim would be, it would be the same thing with humans. Depending on our history, our, you know, contingent history, we might have come up with different moral rules ourselves. So I want to get back to the very, very first question that I started out this talk with: can monkeys be moral? And of course, that was my trick question, right? Because this is my M. Night Shyamalan moment that I'm about to pull here. But because we are, of course, monkeys, right? And so when we're asking whether monkeys can be moral, we're actually asking, can we be moral as humans? And I think there's plenty of evidence. I think there's hope for us as a group. I think there's plenty of evidence that things like fairness are innate, that we do have moral emotions that go beyond that. There's a lot of stuff I didn't talk about here, things like reciprocity. You know, animals go overboard to do certain things to amend when there's moral disputes, to fix those things up. So there's lots of things like pride, shame, and guilt. There's lots of reasons to think that we have built-in moral, you know, instincts or emotions around these things. So I'll just leave it to that, leave it there, and say, you know, thank goodness that we're monkeys.